Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lanterns, lower the volume, and take a slow stroll into one of those odd corners of history that everyone sort of knows exists, but doesn't really want to think about too much. Executioners. The men who literally had cut people's heads off written in their job description. And no, this isn't going to be a loud or gory campfire story. We're not here to make your heart race. We're here to talk calmly about how this very specific, very awkward profession shaped medieval towns, families, and reputations. Because, spoiler, it turns out that being the guy who swings the axe was not as glamorous as TV dramas like to suggest. In fact, it was usually the exact opposite. Executioners weren't feared celebrities. They were usually treated more like radioactive outcasts that people desperately needed but didn't want to invite to dinner. So, let's settle in. Maybe pour a tea, get your blanket, and imagine yourself in a medieval town square. The crowd's gathering, the bells are tolling, and somewhere in the shadows, a man is sharpening his sword. He doesn't really want to be there either, but it's his job and his life. Well, let's drift into it. The awkward birth of the profession. Here's the thing about executioners in the Middle Ages. Almost nobody chose this career path voluntarily. Unlike, say, becoming a blacksmith or a merchant, there wasn't an apprenticeship program where 10-year-old boys ran around saying, "When I grow up, I want to chop off heads." Nope. Most executioners were either forced into it or kind of trapped by circumstance. One common pipeline was criminals. If you were convicted of some nasty crime, the authorities might spare you from hanging if you agreed to become the town's executioner, which sounds like a deal until you realize that it's basically trading one form of social death for another. You wouldn't swing from the gallows, but you'd live the rest of your life as the guy everyone spit at in the market. Another path was inheritance. That's right, executioner families existed. If your dad was the local headsman, there was a pretty high chance you'd end up inheriting the job. Mostly because nobody else wanted it, and towns like to keep the dirty work contained in one unlucky bloodline. Congratulations, son, you're carrying on the proud family tradition of being hated by everyone you meet. And then there were the very occasional volunteers. These were usually men who were so desperate for steady pay that they accepted the job, even knowing it came with lifelong stigma. Desperation, poverty, or just a total lack of other options drove them there. So right from the start, executioners weren't heroes or villains. They were stuck, pressed into service, locked into it by birth, or squeezed into it by poverty, which makes their lives, honestly, more tragic and awkward than terrifying. The paycheck. Nobody wanted now. Here's where it gets even more ironic. Executioners were actually paid pretty well. Town councils knew they had to sweeten the deal, because otherwise, who on earth would do it? So they gave them salaries, often larger than what bakers or butchers made. They sometimes even gave them free housing, or tax exemptions. On paper, being an executioner could look like a cushy government gig. But of course, money didn't buy respect. The locals still avoided them like the plague. Imagine walking into the tavern, plopping down your coin and watching the guy behind the bar carefully set your mug just a little farther away from everyone else's, because nobody wanted to drink from the same pitcher as the man who touched corpses all day, and the money came with another catch. Payment was often per job. So, if a town went through a peaceful stretch with fewer criminals being executed, congratulations, your paycheck just shrank. This meant some executioners were surprisingly motivated to advertise their services. And yes, some traveled between towns, freelancing. Picture it like a medieval Uber, but for decapitation. Outcasts. With benefits, executioners lived in a very weird social category. They were shunned, but they also held a sort of strange, backhanded respect. People might cross the street to avoid them, but they also knew this man had a sword, a steady hand, and an inside connection to the town authorities. This gave rise to one of the strangest perks. Executioners often moonlighted as healers. Yes, the same guy who cut off heads in the morning might reset your broken arm in the afternoon. Because, oddly enough, executioners were seen as having a kind of mystical or medical expertise. They dealt with the human body more than anyone else, after all. And since they handled corpses, they sometimes collected body parts, blood, bones, fat, that were believed to have magical or medicinal properties. So if your joints hurt, you might go to the very man you otherwise refused to shake hands with. It was all extremely hypocritical, but very medieval. The house on the edge of town physically, executioners were often pushed to the margins, literally. Their houses were usually built outside the main town walls, close to the gallows or execution grounds. It wasn't just symbolic distance. Townspeople really didn't want to bump into them in the streets. Their wives and children carried the same stigma. Kids of executioners had trouble marrying outside their circle, because nobody wanted to be connected to the blood family. Executioner daughters often ended up marrying executioners' sons, which kept the families isolated and, well, socially inbred. Imagine growing up knowing that you could never fully escape your family's role. That no matter how kind or friendly you were, your name basically screamed, "My dad hangs people for a living." Medieval high school was already tough. This made it unbearable. The big day at work. Now let's picture the job itself. The part everyone imagines, the actual execution. Medieval justice was a sort of grim community theater. Executions weren't private affairs. They were public spectacles. Crowds gathered, merchants sold snacks, and sometimes there were even jugglers or musicians to keep people entertained while they waited. And in the center of it all was the executioner. He'd walk up in his work clothes, not necessarily a black hood. By the way, that's more of a later theatrical invention. In many cases, executioners wore fairly ordinary clothing, though sometimes with red or black accents to mark the occasion. His job was to make it look clean, fast, dignified, which sounds straightforward, until you realize that medieval swords and axes weren't precision instruments. If the blade was dull or the executioner nervous, you could end up with multiple messy swings. And the crowd? Oh, they noticed. In fact, botched executions were so embarrassing that towns sometimes fined their own executioners for sloppy work. Imagine missing your swing at the worst possible time, and then losing part of your paycheck because of it. That's pressure. So a good executioner was valued, in a twisted way, for being efficient. People might hate him, but they also whispered, well, at least he's quick. Between the axe swings, when there wasn't an execution scheduled, the job description got broader. Executioners were often in charge of lesser punishments. This could mean whipping criminals, branding them, or chopping off smaller body parts, fingers, ears, that sort of thing. Again, not glamorous. They were also tasked with cleaning up dead animals from the streets, removing trash, and sometimes even disposing of suicides' bodies. Basically, they were the municipal sanitation department, but with more blood. And since they had sharp tools and steady hands, they occasionally doubled as knackers, people who dealt with animal carcasses, which, again, only reinforced the idea that executioners were permanently stuck with dirty work. Strange friendships with criminals. Here's one more odd detail. Executioners often knew criminals better than anyone else. They'd spend time with condemned prisoners in the hours before execution, sometimes even sharing a meal. It was part ritual, part mercy. The condemned person's last drink, their final words, often happened in the presence of the very man about to end their life. That made for some strange bonds. Executioners became confessors of sorts, listening to desperate stories nobody else would hear. And of course, they also had to keep their own emotions flat. You can't exactly weep in front of the crowd when you've just spent 3 hours sharing bread with the man you're about to behead. So executioners built a mask of indifference. Calm, detached, maybe even slightly sarcastic. In other words, the perfect bedtime narrator. Let's drift to another gallows so bay. So as we float deeper into this world of medieval justice, remember, the executioner wasn't just a sinister figure in a hood. He was also a neighbor, a father, a reluctant doctor, a trash collector, and sometimes the loneliest man in town. His life was a mix of fear, necessity, and irony. Paid well, but unwanted. Needed desperately, but never embraced. A man everyone hoped to avoid, but nobody could do without. And that tension, that constant dance between usefulness and rejection, is what made the secret lives of medieval executioners so strange. But of course, we're only at the edge of the scaffold. There's plenty more to wander through. The reputations executioners carried, the little side hustles they invented, the bizarre urban legends that grew around them, and the famous botched jobs that kept whole towns talking. We'll get to all of that, slowly, because tonight we're not rushing. We're letting history take its time. So, we left off with the executioner standing at the edge of the scaffold, paid well, feared, but forever unwelcome at the neighborhood barbecue. Tonight, let's step away from the public square and peek behind the door of his home. Because if you think the townsfolk had a tough time dealing with their local executioner, imagine being his kid. Dinner with Dad. Let's imagine a medieval evening. The candles are lit, the bread is on the table, the soup smells like something vaguely edible, and across from you is Dad, who spent the day chopping ears off petty thieves and cleaning up a dead horse carcass by the city gate. Now, children of executioners didn't necessarily find this shocking. It was normal. Dad's job was just dad's job. The same way a baker's kid got used to flour dust everywhere, executioners' kids grew up with whetstones, swords, and the faint smell of blood as household decor. But society never let them forget. Other kids at school, or rather at the local parish lessons, were quick to remind them, "Oh, don't sit too close, your dad touches corpses." Medieval bullying at its finest. And when those children grew up, their marriage prospects were limited. Executioner families tended to marry within their own small circle. Daughters of one executioner often married sons of another, which meant over time, these families formed little dynasties. Tiny, grim networks of blood workers stretching across regions. The executioner's wife spouses carried the stigma too. Wives of executioners often couldn't sell goods in the marketplace unless they did so under the table or through another person. Some had to act like they weren't married at all when doing business, because customers refused to buy bread or cloth from the hangman's wife. But on the flip side, executioner families sometimes developed little monopolies. Since they were already excluded, they leaned into niche trades, like tanning leather, disposing of waste, or selling medical remedies made from human fat or bone. Yes, human fat was considered medicinal. And yes, executioner families sometimes had jars of it in the pantry. Bon appetit. The wife often helped with these side businesses, so while she couldn't gossip at the well with other women, she might be quietly running one of the most profitable backdoor pharmacies in town. Social exile, but with perks. Kids on the career path children of executioners were almost doomed to follow the path. Sons were groomed to inherit the sword, daughters to marry into another family with the same job. A few tried to break free. Some ran off, joined the army, or entered monasteries. But their family names often betrayed them. "Oh, you're the son of the hangman? Interesting? We don't really have a place for you here." Doors closed. In some towns, executioner families even had special marks in the town registry books. Generations later, the stigma still clung, which meant even if a great-grandson wanted to become a carpenter, the parish record might whisper, "Yes, but don't forget, his ancestor was the one who chopped off 15 heads in 1423. Talk about a permanent resume stain. The daily grind. So, what did an average week look like for an executioner when there wasn't a big dramatic beheading? Mostly, chores nobody else wanted to touch. Cleaning dead animals off the street. Removing trash and sewage from ditches. Disposing of bodies of criminals, suicides, or plague victims. Whipping or branding petty criminals. Occasionally running torture sessions in the town dungeon. That last one, torture, was another grim duty. Interrogations weren't always about gathering truth. They were more like legally sanctioned theater, where the confession was just a formal step in the process. And guess who handled the whips, racks, and thumbscrews? Yes, the executioner. So between executions, he was basically the all-purpose janitor of crime and punishment. Not glamorous, not fun, but steady, the side hustle economy. Since executions weren't daily, most executioners built side businesses. Some became knackers, slaughtering animals and selling meat. Others made leather. A few, as mentioned, sold medicine made from criminals' bodies. Human fat was believed to cure joint pain. Blood was thought to treat epilepsy. Powdered skulls could help with headaches. Executioners had ready access to all these ingredients, and the superstitious public was willing to pay, ironically, from the same hands they refused to shake at church. It was a kind of backdoor respect. People whispered that executioners had knowledge of life and death. They were seen as half magician, half bogeyman, which gave them this weird dual status. Social outcasts, but also bearers of secret powers. Famous faces behind the axe. Even though most executioners were anonymous, a few names stuck. And no, they weren't glamorous celebrities. More like local legends of awkwardness. Take Franz Schmidt, one of the best documented executioners of Renaissance Germany. He worked in Nuremberg in the late 1500s and kept a meticulous diary of every execution he performed. What's fascinating is that Schmidt didn't see himself as a monster. He viewed his work as a kind of service, a grim necessity that kept order. And because he was unusually conscientious, meaning he rarely botched a job, he actually gained a measure of respect. Later in life, he retired as a kind of folk hero, even running a medical practice. Imagine that. Dr. Schmidt, formerly the man who beheaded 394 people, will now see you for your rash, comforting. Or consider Charles-Henri Sanson, the French executioner who served during the Revolution. He's the one who famously guillotined Louis XVI. The Sanson family had been in the execution business for 6 generations. passing down the job like an heirloom nobody wanted, but couldn't get rid of. And yet, Sanson himself apparently disliked his work. He saw it as a heavy burden, not a thrill. But duty and family legacy kept him there. Again, not a monster, just stuck. The botched jobs, of course. Not all executioners were efficient. Some had very bad days at work. Take the case of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587. The executioner needed 3 swings of the axe, plus an awkward sawing motion to finish the job. The crowd cringed, the officials shifted nervously, and the poor man probably went home wishing the earth would swallow him. Botched executions were humiliating for everyone. The condemned suffered, the crowd grew restless, and the executioner's reputation took a serious hit. Too many mistakes, and he could be dismissed, which meant unemployment, poverty, and social ruin. So ironically, executioners were judged not just by death, but by their efficiency of death. Clean, quick work was a source of pride. Sloppy work? A disaster. The executioner's reputation. Despite the stigma, executioners carried a weird aura. They were feared, but also gossiped about. People made up stories. He has the devil's hand. He drinks blood. He knows the secret herbs to cure any disease. Executioner families sometimes leaned into this reputation, marketing themselves as healers or charm sellers. After all, if people already think you're creepy, why not make a little money from it? And yet beneath all that, most executioners were just ordinary men, tired, overworked, trying to feed their families, trapped in a job they didn't choose, more janitors of death than villains. Let's drift toward the gallows again. So we've seen the home life, the family table, the daily grind. We've met Franz Schmidt polishing his diary, Sanson dragging his family curse, and the poor fellow who couldn't quite get Mary Stuart's head off in one go. And through all of it, the pattern repeats. Executioners were essential but despised, paid well but excluded, respected in whispers but shunned in daylight, which makes their lives some of the strangest, most ironic corners of medieval society. Neither hero nor villain, just permanently awkward. In Part 3, we'll drift further into the myths and rituals surrounding executions, the crowd's role, the condemned's last words, and the strange little ceremonies that turned these events into half-legal, half-religious theater. But for now, let's just sit with the image of the executioner at home, spooning soup, his children staring at him, the whole town avoiding him, and yet knowing they'd all need him again soon enough. So far we've wandered through the lonely homes of executioners, peeked at their soup bowls, and watched them sharpen their axes. But the real stage, the place where their reputations were made or destroyed, was the scaffold. Because in medieval Europe, an execution wasn't just a punishment. It was a public performance. Think of it like an unwanted town festival where everyone showed up. Not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't resist the drama. A day at the gallows. Imagine waking up on a crisp spring morning in, say 1450. Word spreads through the streets. Someone's going to be executed today. Shops close early. Families pack up their baskets. The baker sells out of bread rolls to people bringing snacks for the trip. And yes, people brought snacks. Medieval crowds treated executions like a combination of court hearing, Sunday sermon, and sporting event. Morbid, yes, but also free entertainment in an era before Netflix. The scaffold was built in the town square, or outside the walls near the gallows. Wooden platforms, sturdy enough to hold the condemned, the officials, the executioner, and sometimes a priest. Everyone wanted a good view. Children sat on shoulders, merchants hawked drinks, and the town crier made sure nobody missed the announcements. And then, when the prisoner appeared, all eyes turned. The condemned's last act, the person about to die wasn't just there to be punished. They had a role to play. Their last words mattered. Maybe even more than the swing of the axe. They were expected to confess, repent, and warn the crowd about the dangers of sin. In a sense, they were actors in their own morality play. Look at me, sinner, now paying for my crimes. Don't follow my path. This wasn't optional. Refuse to repent and the crowd might boo. Repent dramatically. Maybe even weep a little, and you could earn a strange kind of sympathy. Executioners often stood by quietly, guiding the ritual along. Sometimes they even gave advice. Keep it short. Don't faint. The crowd's waiting. Practical tips from the man about to remove your head. Priests, processions, and prayers. Religion draped over the entire event. A priest usually walked with the condemned from the prison to the scaffold, chanting prayers, carrying crosses, sometimes even leading hymns with the crowd. It gave the whole thing a strange mix of theater and liturgy. Half church service, half bloodletting. People genuinely believed the condemned's repentance could save their soul, even if their body was minutes away from being separated from its head. And if the condemned seemed unrepentant, well, the executioner's job suddenly felt heavier, because not only was he ending a life, but he was now ushering an unsaved soul into eternity. Talk about pressure. The executioner's stage presence. The executioner himself had a performance to manage. He wasn't just swinging steel, he was shaping the crowd's reaction. Stand too arrogantly, and people hissed. Look too nervous, and people lost confidence. Botch the job, and your reputation plummeted faster than a dropped guillotine blade. So, most executioners developed a kind of calm, practiced demeanor. No theatrics, no speeches, just quiet efficiency. And yes, contrary to Hollywood, they usually didn't wear black hoods. That imagery mostly comes from later theater and 19th century melodramas. In reality, many executioners dressed fairly normally, sometimes even in bright clothes, to be visible from a distance. The hood would have made them look suspicious, when everyone already knew who they were. After all, they were the only ones in town who lived in the weird house by the gallows. No need for a disguise. The crowd's reaction, once the blade came down, the crowd reacted in its own complicated way. Some cheered. Some crossed themselves. Some just quietly filed home, satisfied they'd witnessed justice. But crowds could also turn ugly. If people thought the condemned had been wrongly punished, they might jeer at the officials, or even at the executioner. He could become the scapegoat for unpopular political decisions. So an execution wasn't always about justice. It was also about crowd control. A way for rulers to remind everyone who held power, while giving the public a strange mix of fear and catharsis. Strange little rituals executions came with odd traditions that varied from place to place. The last meal, not always a feast but usually something. Bread, wine, maybe a bit of meat if the town was generous. Sometimes the executioner sat and ate with the condemned, a grim form of companionship before the end. Coins to the executioner. In some places, the condemned or their family were expected to tip the man who killed them. A twisted form of customer service, touching the body. The crowd often scrambled to touch the corpse or dip cloths in the blood, believing it carried healing powers. Nothing says community health like a shared bucket of freshly spilled human blood. Heads on display. After decapitations, heads were sometimes stuck on spikes at city gates, a medieval version of a billboard. Welcome to town. Behave yourself. These rituals weren't just morbid. They reinforced authority, religion, and superstition all at once. The children watching one of the most unsettling details is how normal these events were for kids. Children grew up watching executions as regular civic events. Picture a 10-year-old eating roasted nuts while watching someone lose their head. It wasn't seen as traumatizing. It was seen as educational. A vivid lesson in obedience, courtesy of the executioner's blade. Which meant children grew up knowing exactly who the executioner was, what his family did, and why they weren't supposed to play at his house. The stigma embedded itself early, generation after generation. Executions as entertainment. It's easy to think of these as grim affairs, but they weren't always viewed that way. Some towns treated them almost like fairs. There'd be jugglers, musicians, and vendors. The crowd might stick around afterward for drinking and gossip. The condemned person became a kind of dark celebrity. For a brief moment, their story, their crime, their words were on everyone's lips. And then, once the axe fell, attention drifted back to daily life. The crowd dispersed, the baker reopened, and the scaffold sat quiet until the next performance, when things went wrong. But of course, not every execution was smooth. Sometimes the condemned fought back, sometimes the crowd rioted, and sometimes the executioner, well, just had a really bad day. One legendary case in 16th century Germany involved an executioner who had to swing 7 times to decapitate a criminal. By the end, the crowd was furious. He was fined, mocked, and nearly chased out of town. Other times, equipment failed. Ropes broke during hangings. Wheels splintered during torture. These mishaps weren't just awkward. They were seen as signs from God. Maybe the condemned wasn't meant to die. Maybe justice had gone too far, which left the executioner stuck in the middle. He had to repeat the punishment, no matter how messy, while the crowd gasped and whispered about divine signs. Not exactly a fun workday. Let's drift toward the silence. Picture it. The execution is over. The body lies on the ground. The priest mutters a final prayer. The crowd disperses. And the executioner, he quietly collects his tools, maybe wipes his blade, and walks home. No applause. No thanks. Just the lingering stares of people who'll avoid him tomorrow at the market. This was his life. Center stage one moment, pariah the next. A man who lived both inside and outside the town's rhythms. Essential, yet unwanted. Always needed. Never embraced. And tomorrow he'd be back to clearing trash from the ditches or tending to a sick neighbor. If that neighbor could swallow their pride enough to ask for help. Strange, isn't it?